If it's Thursday, the Supreme Court hears arguments in a crucial case that could decide the fate of the president's push to end birthright citizenship, while also reshaping the ability of judges to fight unlawful actions by the president. Plus, President Trump says the U.S. and Iran are close to reaching a nuclear deal after a top Iranian official tells NBC News in an exclusive interview that Tehran is willing to make key concessions. And all over the map, high-level peace talks between Ukraine and Russia stalled in Turkey today as President Trump tells reporters that, quote, nothing will happen until he and Russian President Putin meet face to face. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamisha Sendor in Washington, where today the Supreme Court heard arguments in a case that could impact who is considered a citizen in this country and could totally reshape how judges respond when the president oversteps or abuses his legal authority. Today, the High Court heard arguments challenging President Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship, a right many legal experts agree is enshrined in the Constitution's 14th Amendment. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by former President Barack Obama, said the order violated at least 4 Supreme Court precedents.
The president is violating not just one, but by my count, 4 established Supreme Court precedents. We have the one ARC case where we said fealty to a foreign sovereign doesn't defeat your entitlement. Your parents' fealty to a foreign sovereign doesn't defeat your entitlement to citizenship as a child. We have another case where we said that even if your parents are here illegally, if you're born here, you're a citizen. We have yet another case that says even if your parents came here and were stopped at the border, but you were born in our territory, you're still a citizen. And we have another case that says, even if your parents secured citizenship illegally, you're still a citizen. So as far as I see it, this order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents.
The U.S. Solicitor General, arguing on behalf of the Trump administration, pushed back. He argued that the common interpretation of the 14th Amendment is too broad and should not apply to children of undocumented immigrants. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was appointed to the court by President Trump, expressed skepticism about the logistics of the order.
It's just a very practical question how this is going to work. What do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn?
I don't think they do anything different. What the executive order says in Section 2 is that federal officials do not accept documents that have the wrong designation of citizenship from people who are subject to the executive order.
How are they going to know that?
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could.
Such as?
Such as they could require a showing of, documentation showing legal presence in the country. For a temporary visitor, for example, they could see whether they're on a B-1 visa, which would exclude kind of the birthright citizenship in that context.
For all the newborns? Is that how that's going to work?
Again, we don't know because the agencies were never given the opportunity to formulate the guidance. They would have 30
They're only
days.
going to have 30 days to do this. You think they can get it together in time?
They're under. That's what the executive order instructs them to do, and hopefully they will do so.
And today's hearing dealt with far more than just President Trump's executive order. It was also about whether federal judges in lower courts have the authority to issue nationwide injunctions to place a pause on actions they deem unconstitutional. Multiple judges have already imposed those kinds of injunctions against the Trump administration, holding some of its most sweeping policies, including its executive order on birthright citizenship. That question was front and center in today's arguments, with multiple judges suggesting they had reservations about curtailing the judicial branch's ability to uniformly address urgent legal questions about the executive branch's actions. The court's liberal judges warned it would open up a Pandora's box that could allow the executive branch to run roughshod over judges and the rule of law. At one point, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, another Trump appointee, challenged the U.S. Solicitor General about this administration's respect for lower court rulings.
You would respect the opinions and the judgments of the Supreme Court, and you're saying you would respect the judgment, but not necessarily the opinion of a lower court.
And again, I think in the vast majority of instances, our practice has been to respect the opinion as well, in the circuits as well. But my understanding is that has not been a categorical practice in the way respect for the precedents and the judgments of the Supreme Court has been.
NBC News senior Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Horley joins me now. Also with me is NBC News legal analyst Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney and former senior official at the FBI. So, Lawrence, I want to turn to you first. Did the justices give any indication here that of how they would rule, either on birthright citizenship or nationwide injunctions?
Right. So, as you discussed, there's lots of complicated intervening kind of factors in this case. And, so my read of it was that the court is very reluctant to say that states can't sue to block this nationwide because the harms caused by the birthright citizenship order can't be remedied by an injunction that only applies to the state, and it has to apply nationwide because there's so much, people moving in and out of states, and states have to then figure out, who's a citizen, who isn't a citizen. It would put a lot of burden on the states to do that. So that's, one issue where it seems like, as far as the birthright citizenship order goes, that the court might be reluctant to allow it to go into effect at all. But on the nationwide injunction issue, they definitely have concerns about these rulings by judges across the country that have blocked not just Trump policies, but Obama policies, Biden policies. And it's possible that they could try to say something that will give guidance to lower court judges that will tell them, you need to be a bit more careful before you issue these nationwide injunctions.
It's really interesting, Chuck. I also want to just look at the 14th Amendment, if we could, for a minute. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That seems pretty clear to many experts, but is it clear that President Trump's executive order violates this amendment, or is there some wiggle room here?
Well, I think it's reasonably clear, Yamiche. I mean, it has been our common understanding ever since the 14th Amendment was enacted in 1868, and ever since a seminal Supreme Court case in 1898 interpreted that very language. There's really only two categories of people who are excluded as citizens under that subject to the jurisdiction thereof language. First, if, Yamiche, your parents were diplomats, let's say from the UK, and were assigned here and you were born to their union while in this country, you wouldn't be a citizen. That's a commonly understood exception. The other is a incredibly rare one. I don't know that it's happened, but if you were the child of parents who were invaders, a hostile army invading the United States, and your parents both served, and you were born in this country under those circumstances. Other than that, Yamiche, the common understanding is that subject to the jurisdiction thereof, as Justice Sotomayor laid out today, includes people who are here as a result of their parents arriving unlawfully.
There's another issue here, Lawrence, which is that Justice Clarence Thomas said that the U.S. survived without nationwide injunctions until the 1960s. Explain what he's talking about there, and is there a big change here?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a big change. I think everyone kind of agrees with that. Justice Brett Kavanaugh discussed it during the argument today, where he was talking about, Congress doesn't pass as many laws anymore. There's deadlock in Washington. We all know about that. Congress not passing laws that address kind of issues that come up. So when a new president gets elected, they promise these things to the voters and they want to get things done. And so now they try to do them through executive action instead of doing it through Congress. And that raises big legal issues about whether the president has the power to do that without legislation. And so we've seen this happen over the last couple of decades. It kind of became a big thing during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, but it also happened during the Obama administration, even going back to the George W. Bush administration. And presidents of all parties have complained about this bitterly when they're in office. Of course, they're not so worried about it when they're not in office. But the Supreme Court justices have repeatedly kind of questioned whether they should do something about this. And so that's why they decided to hear arguments in this case.
And it's so interesting for both of you, because I was kind of struck by the fact that they spent so much time talking about injunctions. And Chuck, for you, I wonder, I'm going to play a little bit of sound from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson talking about the Trump administration's view on injunctions. Take a listen.
Let me just turn your attention to one other thing, because the real concern, I think, is that your argument seems to turn our justice system, in my view at least, into a catch-me-if-you-can kind of regime from the standpoint of the executive, where everybody has to have a lawyer and file a lawsuit in order for the government to stop violating people's rights.
Chuck, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it. I did listen to that part of the argument today with some interest, Yamiche. So we want similarly situated people to be treated similarly. And if a president, to Lauren's point, a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, issues an executive order that's arguably unconstitutional, we don't want every single person who is affected to have to go litigate that matter individually in 94 different federal districts. So that's what Justice Jackson was getting at, and I think it's a compelling point. But the devil's in the details, Yamiche. How do you craft a rule which permits nationwide injunctions in some cases, but not in all? And perhaps you do so only when there's a significant constitutional issue at stake. And it seems that the president, again, Democrat or Republican, is wrong on the law.
Well, as you talk about that sort of in the details of this and how it would work, I wonder how much upheaval do you think it would create if the Supreme Court decides, actually, we're going to change the way that these nationwide injunctions function?
Right. So, again, it depends on how they set down the rule. Is there a narrowing of the ability of a single federal district court judge to issue a nationwide injunction? Is it the case that you can only do it in very limited circumstances, so a significant or severe narrowing? Again, if you have to have every single person who might be adversely affected, to Justice Jackson's point, go in and litigate the matter individually, then similarly situated people will not be treated similarly. And so the birthright citizenship backdrop to this is quite interesting, Yamiche. But the issue really on the table before the Supreme Court is both the propriety and the sort of the mechanism for nationwide injunctions.
And Lawrence, I wonder, as we touched on it, this idea of sort of what the Trump administration thinks about lower court rulings. Do you think that that is going to at all impact how the Supreme Court sees this case when they hear what the Trump administration is saying about lower court rulings?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't any direct discussion about that in the case today, but there was some pushback from justices when the Solicitor General was kind of making, not giving an inch on any of the arguments, including whether, if an appeals court ruled in a certain way, would the Justice Department follow the precedent in that circuit that court has set? She wasn't even willing to accept that premise. So, it may be a sort of underlying issue that's going along, and they've had other cases even since they agreed to hear arguments in this case. They've had other cases coming up to them involving Trump administration orders where they've been accused of violating court orders. So it may be something at the back of their minds.
And is there a possibility of a split decision, something where you see birthright citizenship maybe rolled against, but injunctions changed?
Well, I think there is a possibility that they could say, because there's 3 different cases here and 3 different nationwide injunctions, and there's 2 of them involve states. And so, as I said earlier, they could say nationwide injunctions are good as far as the states are concerned because of the specific harms that they've had, but they could try to narrow or give some guidance to lower court judges that says cool your jets on giving nationwide injunctions to individual plaintiffs, which is the other case. So we could see, a little complicated ruling coming out at some time in the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, I know you're going to break it down. So, Chuck, I want to ask you, what are you looking for next?
Well, one thing, of course, Yamiche, would be how fast this decision comes down. More likely than not, June or July. It could be faster. But people's lives are affected by this. And, in order to plan, we need some transparency and regularity, and having different rules in different parts of the country isn't particularly regular.
Yeah, well, definitely a case that we're going to be watching very closely. So thank you, Lawrence and Chuck, for bringing your expertise in reporting. And now turning to the Middle East, where the president is on his final leg of his first major foreign trip since taking office. Throughout the trip, President Trump has repeatedly warned that Iran can never get a nuclear weapon. That comes after several rounds of talks between the U.S. and Iranian officials, and after the president told Meet the Press that he wanted a, quote, total dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Today, while speaking at a business roundtable in Qatar, the president seemed to hint that a deal with Iran was close, though he didn't provide any details.
It's very simple. It's not like I have to give you 30 pages worth of details. There's only one sentence: they can't have a nuclear weapon. And I think we're getting close to maybe doing a deal.
The president is now in the UAE, where he received a lavish welcome, like we saw during his previous stops in the region. The pomp continued with an official state dinner and visit at the presidential palace in Abu Dhabi. And joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, who's in Abu Dhabi, and NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, who is in Tehran. So, Garrett, I know you're having a good time, so good to see you. President Trump appeared optimistic about a potential nuclear deal with Iran. Can you tell us how close this is? Do we know any more about what this deal could even look like?
Well, I don't know that it's especially close, but it seemed to be a reaction to Richard's great interview with a senior member of the Iranian regime and advisor to the supreme leader there that the president turned around and reposted today, suggesting that Iran would be willing to end its pursuit of nuclear weapons entirely and give up its enrichment of uranium to the stage necessary to turn it into weapons in exchange for sanction relief. That appears to mirror what the U.S. most recent offer to Iran has been on that topic. And so the president expressing some optimism, although this does seem to be a case where, as he sort of alluded to in that bite, they may have a big picture agreement, but in terms of how things actually come together and how even these ideas would be enforced and followed through upon, I don't think they're anywhere near that level of specificity, Amish.
And President Trump, we have to remind folks, he withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by former President Obama. Is there a scenario where we get a deal that's similar to the one that he blew up and we end up right back where we were in 2018?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, this president is particularly distrustful of any kind of multilateral agreement, particularly any kind of multilateral agreement that was engaged in by one of his Democratic predecessors. And so even if he's essentially retracing the work of the Obama administration and the U.S.'s European partners in striking the original Iran nuclear agreement to come up with something that looks very similar, I think he will feel more confident in it. Now, I think also the big difference is his belief that his maximum pressure strategy during his 4 years as president really weakened Iran economically to the point where they might be more willing to follow the rules laid out in some kind of agreement here, knowing what the consequences were in his 4-year term when there was not an agreement in place.
And the president is, of course, on his final leg of this Middle East trip. How much do you think the president's view of the region has changed? And what do you think is different as you're on the ground reporting?
Well, look, I was not on that original trip 8 years ago now, but I can tell you from covering this president for a long time, I do think his view has changed substantially. I think he's come to see a lot of himself in the way that some of these Arab leaders operate, some sort of authoritarian, realpolitik, very proud of their exercise of power, very unencumbered by what the rest of the world thinks about them, and willing to use influence very transactionally. It's the way that the president operated in his private business dealings and much the way that he likes to operate in foreign policy. He sees that reflected back here. He likes the kind of welcome that he gets. And I also think you're seeing him create some distance from himself on a number of foreign policy issues from Benjamin Netanyahu and from the Israeli foreign policy system, which I think during his first term, he was sort of more inclined to move in lockstep there. Now he feels a little bit more freedom to follow his own instincts, and they're leading him here to the Gulf region, where he thinks he and the United States can make a lot of money by not being too concerned about what goes on behind closed doors in these countries when the U.S. isn't around or interested, Yamiche.
Yeah, well, President Trump following his instincts, that's definitely something that's going to continue. So thank you so much, Garrett Haake, for your reporting. And Richard, what are you hearing from officials in Iran about a potential nuclear deal?
Iran and the Trump administration now appear to be quite close to reaching a deal. I spoke to a top advisor to Iran's supreme leader, one of the most powerful men in this country, and he laid out the conditions under which Iran would accept a deal. He said that Iran would agree to never have a nuclear weapon, that it would get rid of its highly enriched uranium, that it would only enrich uranium to a low level required for civilian uses only, that it would allow in international inspectors to oversee all of this and verify that it is complying with this deal in exchange for the immediate lifting of all sanctions. The interview got a lot of attention. It has been played on state television here in Iran. President Trump posted it on Truth Social and told reporters that Iran has, quote unquote, sort of agreed to the deal. The final details obviously still need to be worked out. Negotiations are ongoing. But considering the amount of positive attention this framework discussion is getting both from President Trump himself and Iran, it seems like the two sides are getting quite close.
And thank you so much, Richard Engel, for that report. And coming up, I am here. That was Ukrainian President Zelensky's message to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who stayed home as Ukraine and Russia sent delegations to Turkey for peace talks. Plus, Johnson's juggling act. The House speakers rushed to wrangle all corners of his conference around a tax deal that's crucial to moving the Trump agenda forward. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. After some confusion and uncertainty, Russian and Ukrainian delegations are expected to meet in Turkey face-to-face for the first time for ceasefire negotiations. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy arrived in Turkey's capital of Ankara earlier today for talks, even after the Kremlin confirmed President Putin would not be attending. But Russia's delegation wasn't in Ankara. It was hundreds of miles away in Istanbul. After meeting with Turkey's president, President Zelenskyy announced he was sending some of his members, the team, to Istanbul. Zelenskyy isn't expected to join them, but he still had a very direct message for President Putin when speaking to reporters from Ankara.
Do you have a message for Vladimir Putin? I'm here. I think this is very clear message.
The confusion over where the talks would take place and who would be attending comes after weeks of diplomatic maneuvering between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine just to get everyone anywhere near a negotiating table. But today, while speaking to reporters on Air Force One, President Trump suggested he didn't expect much progress with these talks, at least not yet.
Nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together, okay? He wasn't going if I wasn't there, and I don't believe anything's going to happen, whether you like it or not, until he and I get together. But we're going to have to get it solved because too many people are dying.
And now NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons joins me now from Istanbul. So President Trump, or should I say President Zelenskyy, is in Turkey today. But he called the delegation Putin sent, quote, stand-in props, rather. So he's calling them props. Will there be any meetings between these two parties at some point? And what do you just make of this confusion? It's so baffling to me.
Yeah, I mean, depends on your view. It's either a mess or a very sophisticated diplomatic game of chess. And you're right, it's very difficult, actually, to know exactly what is going on. We know that the Russian delegation is here because we saw them today outside the Russian consulate. They came out and gave a very brief statement basically saying, we are here, which is kind of the message that Russia is trying to send. The Ukrainians, I think, are here in Istanbul too. President Zelenskyy is saying that his defense minister would lead the delegation. That's a more important figure than the Russians, who have a former culture minister as their lead for their team. And then we're waiting for the Americans to be here. There is a team here already, but the Secretary of State, Secretary Rubio, isn't expected here until tomorrow morning. Will there be face-to-face talks? What exactly is there to talk about? I mean, all of these things are a big question to me. So it really is very difficult, as I say, to know what progress they're going to make here.
Well, as you talk about progress, President Trump said, quote, nothing would happen, no progress in these negotiations he believed would be made until him and President Putin got together personally. So where do the negotiations actually go from here? And does President Putin really have any desire to meet with President Trump?
Oh, I think he does. And I think that President Putin, I think President Putin wants to meet with President Trump, and I think President Trump wants to meet with President Putin. I mean, what's happened is that the lack of a sustained ceasefire by the Russians has made that meeting politically difficult, perhaps impossible, even for someone like President Trump. But what you're seeing there, I think, in those words from the president, is that things are shifting, and that he has said already that he's prepared for meetings to happen without a ceasefire, which is a change from what the Ukrainians were asking for. And now I think it's pretty clear that he believes that is going to need to happen. The problem is you have two very different positions in the Ukrainians and the Russians. And again, the question is, will President Trump, even President Trump, be able to surmount those?
I mean, that is the key question that we're all asking, and I know you're going to keep on asking that question for us, so thank you so much, Keir. Let me now bring in Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. So thank you so much for being here. So it's interesting. President Putin was the one who proposed these talks, and then he decided not to attend. So what's his end game here, other than, of course, maybe possibly trying to take over all of Ukraine? But I wonder just in terms of the way that he handled this.
So you're right, Yamiche. It was his idea, and his idea was prompted by a meeting of the Brits, French, Germans, and Poles last Saturday, where they said, Mr. Putin, you better agree to a ceasefire soon, or we're going to put sanctions on you. So that prompted Putin then to say, OK, let's have a conversation in Turkey next Thursday. And then he decided not to come. So he is clearly uncertain and uncomfortable with this pressure that he's getting from the Europeans and from the Americans. The Europeans coordinated with President Trump on that threat to put sanctions on.
And what do you make of President Zelenskyy showing up in Turkey saying, OK, I'm going to come, and if you don't come, I'll send the delegation to the city that you come to? What do you think the Ukrainian view of all of this is?
Ukrainians are taking the high ground. They said, OK, we'll be there. President Zelenskyy said, Yatut, I'm here. Which is what he said at the beginning of the war. He said, I'm here in Kyiv. They didn't leave. And that was a very important message to the Ukrainian people and to the world. So Zelenskyy is there. He says, I'm ready to negotiate. And where is Putin? Putin didn't show up.
And I wonder what you think Putin's no-show says to President Trump, and whether it might antagonize him, especially as he's continuing to say, I know, President Putin, I can work out this deal. We just got to get at a table, the two of us.
Exactly. President Trump and President Zelenskyy agreed a month and a half ago, nearly 2 months ago, on a ceasefire, on an air, land, and sea 30-day ceasefire. And President Trump took that to President Putin, who said no. And so I think you're right about the irritation, frustration that the United States started to feel about Putin. President Trump started to feel about Putin. He's holding up the show. He's not moving in the direction that President Trump would like it to move.
So do you think that if you do get a President Trump and a President Putin, maybe even Zelenskyy in another city waiting for that phone call to come in, do you think that this could actually get worked out? So
I think it's really important that it's three ways. I don't think it's going to work if it's just the President Trump and President Putin. President Zelenskyy is clearly going to have to be a part of that in order to make it what Secretary Rubio calls a just and lasting peace. It's not going to be a just and lasting peace if the Ukrainians are not there. They have to be at the table. But then, yes, I think it is very possible for the three of them to come up with something. It will take some pressure on Putin. This threat of sanctions or actual sanctions on Putin to make him come to a point where he can agree first to a ceasefire and then longer conversations.
And I wonder, do you think, as you say, all three of them have to be at a table, do you think that Ukraine, President Zelenskyy, that he might welcome President Putin and President Trump sitting down maybe for the first leg of this, and then they open up to all three? Like, what do you think that his view of that is?
My bet is the Ukrainians want to be there at the table from the beginning. And I think that's the only way it's going to be able to be lasting. And the Ukrainian people have to agree to it. I mean, they are the ones that have been invaded. The Russians invaded them, and they need to be at the table, and they need to agree to whatever the final solution is.
And it's interesting, Secretary Rubio and President Trump have they keep hinting at the idea we could walk away if we don't see enough progress here. Do you think that they would actually walk away, or do you think there's just too much at stake?
Yamiche, I think it's too much at stake. I think that's exactly right. And I think you've heard less of this walking away talk in the past couple of days. When President Trump says, I'm going to be engaged, I'm going to sit and talk with President Putin, this is their number one foreign policy priority. I can't see them walking away. It doesn't sound to me like they're serious about walking away.
What is walking away? If the U.S. did walk away, what does that look like?
It's hard to figure. I mean, putting Ukraine on its own. No, this is not going to solve the problem. They want to solve the problem, which is right. They want to stop this war, but in order to do that, they have to stay engaged. So I don't think this walking away is real.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ambassador Taylor, for coming and breaking all this down with the two cities and all of this. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Yamiche.
And up next, a live report from Capitol Hill where House Republicans remain at odds over key tax provisions in the GOP's sweeping mega bill. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning to Capitol Hill, where President Trump's agenda is in limbo one day before it's set to come up for a key vote in the Rules Committee. After more meetings today, there's still no deal consensus among Republicans on capping the state and local tax deduction, the issue that has several moderate Republicans withholding their support. At the same time, some hardliners are digging in for more spending cuts that kick in and for them to kick in sooner. Speaker Johnson said meetings will continue over the weekend to find an agreement, and that will take some give and take. Take a listen.
Not everybody's going to be delighted with every provision in a bill this large, but everyone can be satisfied. And we're very, very close to that. If you do more on SALT, you have to find more in savings. So these are the dials, the metaphorical dials I'm talking about. That's what is involved here. When you're trying to craft a piece of legislation that is this comprehensive and this complex, it requires a lot of thought and deliberation.
My NBC News colleague Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill with all of the latest. So Sahil, I know you've been running around trying to get us an answer. What's the latest on President Trump's agenda on Capitol Hill? Are things getting better or worse for House Republicans? Is Speaker Johnson in for a big headache here, or are they really trying to get through with this massive bill?
Well, Yamiche, if you listen to the way Speaker Johnson is talking, you would think things are getting better. The reality of the situation is I'm not convinced that that's the case, because simply the policy disputes seem very significant on a whole bunch of issues. You mentioned SALT, the state and local deduction. That's one of them. There's also a major debate happening within the Republican conference about Medicaid and the cuts and the various spending restrictions that they're putting on accessing Medicaid benefits. There's also a question of SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, what they do with that. Take a listen to how Congressman Nick LaLota, a New York Republican from Long Island, talked about where they are now.
Still got a lot of work to do, not just on SALT, but on SNAP, on Medicaid, and some of the government benefits issues. Still got a lot of work to do if we're going to get this plane to land here in the next week. We're not further, but we're probably not closer either. Still a lot of specifics that need to be hashed out.
Now, it's true that committees have passed their various pieces and sent them to the budget panel, which is basically supposed to staple them together and move them to the House floor. But we also know some of those committee products are not ready for prime time, especially the tax legislation, which LaLota and several other Republicans are threatening to tank unless they find a compromise, specifically on the state and local tax deduction. So there's plenty of work to do, because moving one of the dials on the state and local tax piece is going to affect the entire rest of the package and could potentially alienate Republicans on the other end.
And as you talk about all of these different factions, we almost see that almost every time there's an interconference fight here with Republicans. Moderates are the ones that end up caving and giving in here. So is that what we're looking at here ultimately, given the fact that we're seeing the way things are developing?
Well, historically, that is how things have traditionally worked in the House when Republicans are in the majority. The hardliners have tended to flex because they've been willing to tank the bills, and the moderates and the centrists and vulnerable and swing districts have caved because they're ultimately not willing to go against the party line. In this case, I'm not so sure, Yamiche, because the House Freedom Caucus has softened a lot this year. They've threatened to tank this budget in various iterations of it. They've threatened to tank the spending bill that Donald Trump was in favor of, but they ultimately cave at the end because these members represent dark red districts where their constituents also want them to be cheerleaders for the Trump agenda and not obstacles for it. So I don't exactly know where this is going to land. What I do know is that these so-called SALT caucus members are deadly serious. Their predecessors lost re-election in those districts in those areas because they supported that $10,000 imposition, that limit in the 2017 Trump tax law, and they are not ready to tolerate this $30,000 cap that House Republican leaders are proposing to them. And then you've got the hardliners who are demanding steep spending cuts of trillions of dollars. Right now, this bill adds trillions of dollars to the long-term national debt. That goes against everything they say they believe in. So where does this shake out at the end? And where does that leave the politically vulnerable members who worry about Medicaid, the single biggest thing that they're being targeted by Democrats? A lot of open questions.
Yeah, and another question, are they going to be able to do it before the Memorial Day recess? We'll see. Thank you so much, Sahil. I appreciate your reporting.
Thank you.
And after the break, America First and first-class conflicts, the fallout of President Trump's first major foreign trip and what it says about the administration's non-traditional approach to global relations. The panel's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. President Trump's swing through the Middle East has raised a number of questions, including this one. Are we starting to see the contours of the new Trump doctrine forming? The president's foreign policy has so far been a patchwork of brash interventionism and America First isolationism. But there does seem to be appearing one guiding principle for the president, and that's repudiating his predecessors. Take a listen to what he had to say on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia.
No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves.
And President Trump expanded on his views of the use of America's might this morning while addressing U.S. troops in Qatar.
As president, my priority is to end conflicts, not start them, but I will never hesitate to wield American power if it's necessary to defend the United States of America or our partners. And this is one of our great partners right here. When we're threatened, America's military will answer our enemies without even thinking about it.
And here to dive into President Trump's agenda in the Middle East is Wall Street Journal senior political correspondent Molly Ball, former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris, Ashley Etienne, and president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. So thank you all for being here. Molly, I want to start with you. Is this the most we've seen President Trump really spell out his view of the world, his Trump doctrine?
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, the things he's saying are strikingly conventional, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember George W. Bush saying he was against nation building when he was running for president. Unfortunately, you know, isolationists tend to be mugged by reality, as it were, and he ended up getting drawn into a number of conflicts. But, you know, this rhetoric of, you know, we're reluctant to intervene, but when we have to, we will. This is something you can imagine Barack Obama saying. It's something you can imagine Joe Biden saying. So I think the question is, what do we learn from his actions? Mm-hmm. And I think the way you started the show, that it has been a sort of confusing hodgepodge. That's still the case. You know, we have the strange sort of imperialism of wanting to take over countries that he's expressed, you know, bombing the Houthis one day and then stopping. So I don't think we have a coherent picture in this second term, especially, of what it is he's willing to do.
In thinking about that coherent picture that we're all maybe trying to search for at some point, how does what he's saying square with what he said about taking over Gaza and saying that he wants to make it a real estate project, essentially, and be owned by the United States?
Well, I think the fact that his first foreign trip is in the Gulf, as it was in his first term, and the fact that he's so focused on deal-making over diplomacy, what is not clear to me is whether that is born out of necessity because the diplomacy has been stymied on multiple fronts, or if this is a product of the way he sees the world because, of course, he is to his core a real estate developer and speaks from that perspective. And I think it's a little bit of both.
And Kevin, it's interesting when we think about sort of what President Trump is talking about. He's talking about individual sovereignty, but he's also talking about sort of pulling back altogether. There's a question of whether or not that creates a power vacuum and whether another country like China steps in. What do you make of that? What are your thoughts?
There are three consistent principles here with Trump and with Vice President Vance, who plays a really important role in this articulation of Trump's foreign policy. The first is the president understands that where there is peace, there is more prosperity for more people. This is very much on display in the Middle East this week. The second is, and you said it very well, national sovereignty is the key, that we can celebrate the diversity, the uniqueness of each country. But as the vice president said, and this is point 3 in his wonderful Munich speech, that if you're our ally, you darn well better pull your weight. Don't come to the United States, as the French and German governments have done for 3 years during the Ukraine conflict, and tell us to spend more of our money when you aren't doing it. If, in fact, our allies do that, this is going to be a golden era, not just for Americans, but also for the world, because of the peace and prosperity that Donald Trump will be ushering in.
It's also interesting when he talks about sort of pulling back the nation builders. He's talking sometimes about Republicans, right? People that are in Congress, the Heritage Foundation. Also, I wonder how you square that, and whether or not sort of the history of the Republican Party now starts in 2016, and that the old foreign policy ways that others, the establishment Republicans for a long time have had, whether that's all gone away now.
You're sitting with your new friend, the president of the Heritage Foundation, who has led the effort in this town for the last 3.5 years, sometimes over the objection of the Wall Street Journal against neoconservatism. There is a lot of space between the interventionism of George W. Bush and the so-called isolationism, which respectfully is really not an accurate description of Trump. And it is a realism, a restraint, that we don't have to be every place. But very importantly, and something that we agree on, is that when we go into conflict, we have a lethal efficiency that dominates that conflict. This is a beautiful thing that is also enjoys bipartisan support.
I would just like to point out that I do not speak for the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I am a news reporter, and they have their opinions, but they're not my opinions.
Thank you for that. It is a very clear distinction to make. Ashley, in 2006, I wonder if you could have thought that Republicans would be talking the way they are now about nation building. Kevin brings up the name President Bush. Could you have seen that this is the Republican Party and their foreign policy would be this?
I mean, you know, I think we're all watching as the Republican Party is being completely co-opted by the MAGA movement. I mean, they're a whole subsidiary of the MAGA movement now. I don't think there is a Republican Party anymore. I mean, let me give you a great example. What was this, 2 years ago, maybe just a few months ago, the Republican Party was completely all up in arms about Hunter Biden potentially influence peddling all around the world. And you have a situation which was over, I think it was overshadowed by the talk of this airplane given by Qatar. But what was missing, and what has been missing in the narrative, is the Trump kids going over, advancing his trip, and not just influence peddling, saying that they represented the government of the United States, trying to strike deals. I mean, it's so blatantly is so blatant. And, you know, so my question right now is, where are all those Republicans that were all up in arms about what Hunter Biden was doing? I mean, now it's on hyperdrive with the Trumps. I mean, they're doing it with no sort of shame, trying to, you know, build wealth. And, you know, and the question is, at what expense to the American people? And that, to me, is the narrative that's really gotten lost. I'm really disappointed in the fact that the Democratic Party has not made bigger hay of this particular issue, not even Joe Biden and his supporters. I mean, I think we just got completely distracted by the airplane. Yeah. You know, and I never thought that airplane was going to be realized. I mean, I have confidence in DOD and our national security advisors that they were going to handle whatever security concern there was. But the point is we're missing the really bigger picture, the real corruption. It wasn't the plane. It's the fact that the Trump sons are over there making money for the Trump family, which I'm not sure that Trump has even divested from. I mean, we don't even know the answer to that particular question. We saw this was a pattern in the first administration where we had an entire investigation on emoluments, and we saw Trump was taking money from the Chinese all around the world. I mean, in the Middle East as well, too. And now we're seeing it now in ways that are just so blatant, and I just don't know why Republicans and Democrats are looking the other way.
Well, Kevin, I want to turn to some of the President Trump's family business dealings. Many of them are overseas. Here is an exchange from my colleague Ryan Nobles, our chief Capitol Hill correspondent, who had with House Speaker Mike Johnson. Take a listen and watch this.
Whatever the President Trump is doing is out in the open. They're not trying to conceal it.
But Mr. Speaker, the investment in the meme coin, those folks are not transparent. We do not know who those people are.
I don't know anything about the meme coin thing. I don't know. I can just tell you that, I mean, President Trump has had nothing to hide. He's very upfront about it, and there are people who watch all the ethics of that. But I mean, I've got to be concerned with running the House of Representatives.
Is it congressional's oversight, though? That's the congressional responsibility, is it not?
Congress has oversight responsibility, but I think, so far as I know, the ethics are all being followed.
What's your response to people who say it's really the only excuse for not having oversight over these business dealings by the Trump family is naked politics?
There's tremendous transparency, which is a huge contrast between this administration and the last. And I just have to say, this discourse sounds like the Russia hoax to me. And the reason that I think the left has to do that is because they have to obscure the fact that they've got no aspirational vision for Americans. They have to obscure the fact that while there are fair questions to ask about anything from the Qataris, those questions will be answered by the Department of Defense. This plane's not been given to the Trump family. It's been given to the United States government. But the last thing is, it obscures, and it's an attempt by the left to obscure, a dramatically successful trip with one of the most important speeches given in modern history by an American president about a reset against globalism, which constantly happens at the expense of Americans, Republicans, Democrats of all ethnic backgrounds. That's actually something I would expect the left to celebrate.
Molly, what do you make of the debate that they're having here?
You know, I think it is very interesting how, to Ashley's point, how Democrats have approached this debate, because there is a feeling, and I hear this from a lot of Democrats, that this corruption storyline sort of doesn't resonate, that the first impeachment was sort of about that, and that they didn't necessarily get any political mileage out of it, and that when people hear about corruption, they think of Trump saying drain the swamp, and it isn't necessarily effective on him because he's seen as such an outsider to the establishment. So I think, you know, among the many recriminations and debates that Democrats are having, one of them is, you know, talking about attempts to impeach Trump now, other attacks on the president. They just don't know what works.
Yeah. Well, definitely a conversation. We could have a lot longer conversation, but I appreciate you coming on. Molly, Ashley, Kevin, thank you so much. And still to come, the Director of National Intelligence ousts two top officials accusing them of politicizing intelligence after they oversaw a memo that contradicts the Trump administration's claims about a Venezuelan gang member. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard fired two senior intelligence officials this week after they oversaw an intelligence report that contradicts the president's claims about Venezuelan gang Tren de Agua. I always mess that up. Tren de Agua. Last month, the National Intelligence Council produced a report citing a consensus among all intelligence agencies except the FBI that TDA does not take orders from or operate in close coordination with President Nicolas Maduro's regime. That assessment undermines the Trump administration's rationale for invoking the Alien Enemies Act to deport suspected gang members without due process. Gabbard's deputy chief of staff said the two officials were dismissed because they, quote, politicized intelligence. And joining me now on set is NBC News intelligence reporter Dan DeLuz. So, Dan, I hope you can speak better Spanish than me and pronounce things. So dig us into this findings of what this report was and why these officials were fired.
This is really significant, right? Because this intelligence assessment that these officials oversaw contradicted the president's assertions about this gang, and that was his rationale for invoking this Alien Enemies Act, the 1798 law that allows basically, you know, the deportation of suspected gang members without due process. So it was embarrassing for the White House, and this memo emerged. It actually was obtained through a Freedom of Information request. So it was a difficult moment for the White House, and now they've fired these two officials that are linked to this memo, the group that, and they're very senior analysts, very experienced. They've worked for many presidents over decades. Now, the administration is portraying this as these people were biased in their work, in their intelligence work. But it does raise a lot of questions and a lot of concerns about how the president and the administration are overseeing the intelligence community.
And you've got some new reporting also.
Yes. So Tulsi Gabbard, the director of National Intelligence, who just fired these two officials, seems to be wanting to bolster her role in how in the presentation of intelligence to the president. So the president's daily brief, that famous brief that the president gets every day, is always done out of the CIA. The DNI oversees it, but it's done by this big staff at CIA. It's a very long process. They stay up late at night doing it. She's saying she wants that physically moved to her offices. And that's sort of her way of having tighter control over it. Now, it's unclear how this is going to work, and this could be signal some friction between the CIA and the ODNI as well.
So fundamentally, how much could that change the briefing itself?
That is a very good question. Maybe not at all, maybe significantly. It does seem to suggest that she would have tighter control over what gets into that brief. And of course, the intelligence brief can really affect a president and a White House's decision-making.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dan, with that recent reporting, that new reporting. And we'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.